Can you explain the risks associated with pesticides?
In order to register a pesticide, and this is the second half of my presentation, which goes about the science supporting and how we ensure that pesticides are safe or can be used safely. So each pesticide must go through about 200 separate studies to support its registration. The way these studies are assessed is through a risk assessment. So what regulatory agencies do is taking all these studies together, all this information that is available, and understanding what it means, understanding the impact on humans, the environment, on animals, and understanding what that means in the context of the actual use of the product. This is not just a standalone, oh, what's the potential of this to cause this? No, it's what's the potential in the context of how the product is used. Why do I say that? Because every substance has the potential to be a poison. This is something that has been said for more than 500 years since Paracelsus came up with this. And all chemicals, regardless of source, synthetic, organic, are potentially toxic at some dose. Even water can be toxic. So regardless, it's not about if it's natural or if it's synthetic or the substance. It's about the chemical itself and its potential to cause harm. And any chemical, any substance has that potential to cause harm, but at a given amount. So what the regulatory agencies do is control the amount that we're exposed to it, so we can guarantee that on an acute and a chronic basis, we are protected. So what does it mean? It means that we take into account that potential and we assess the exposure. So PMRA decides this is an acceptable risk or an unacceptable risk. If it's an acceptable risk, then that means the product can be used safely. If it's an unacceptable risk, that means the product is not going to be registered, or maybe the use will not be registered. Let's say that we can control certain insect, but the rate has to be higher. If that higher rate is not acceptable, then even if it provides benefit, it will not be registered. So just put it in simple terms, hazard is the potential to cause harm. Risk is the likelihood of harm in defined circumstances. Because I know this can be complex, and most of you may know about this already. I came up with this example. This is this polar bear, and the polar bear represents the hazard. Polar bears by themselves have certain hazard associated with it. The seal, they have an instinct and they know there is a hazard here, so they try to control their exposure. That's in nature. But when that's not possible, when they don't control their exposure, the risk is very high and then they can die. We all have been in a zoo probably. And when you're in a zoo, you are controlling your exposure. So even though the hazard is the same, because the hazard doesn't change, because your exposure is low, your risk is acceptable. So please notice that I never say that there is no risk. And PMRA will never say that. All I say is that the risk is acceptable. So that's very important to keep in mind. There is nothing that we can say that has no risk. Everything has a risk if there is high enough exposures. What happens if someone doesn't follow directions? So the exposure increases and then the risk increases. Luckily, farmers follow directions, they follow the label, and when they follow the label, they're ensuring that they're protecting themselves, they're protecting the environment, and they're protecting you. So everything we do in life, we're assessing risk. And it's not that we are assessing that kind of on a computational basis every time we do it. Like we just do it by instinct. But when you cross the street, when you take a decision to cross the street in the middle of the road or through a traffic light, you're assessing your risk and you are controlling your exposure by crossing through the traffic light. So your risk is acceptable. All right. So I'm bringing here an example of something that is natural, but a very small amounts could cause harm to infants. Honey is like doctors recommend not to give honey to infants 1 year old or less. The reason for that is because there could be a toxin called botulinum produced by a bacteria, and this toxin at amounts that are significantly small could affect an infant. So that's why it's just avoided. So we're just controlling our exposure. How do we control it here? We just avoid it. However, this same toxin called botulinum is a toxin that is found in something that is normally known as Botox. So this toxin at even lower amounts, at amounts that are so diluted, can be beneficial for medical purposes. So something that is toxic at certain amounts, at lower amounts can actually be beneficial. So again, it's not about the substance, it's about how much you're exposed to that substance. Of course, there are agencies that don't take into account risk, and this is one of them is the International Agency for Research in Cancer. They have classified some activities and compounds as possibly carcinogenic or probably carcinogenic or carcinogenic. So category 1 is the one that has been found, that has been proven to cause cancer in humans. But even for those compounds that are under category 1, we are still exposed to them. You can drink wine, you can be exposed to sun, and as long as you control those exposures, you're going to be protected. Of course, there are exceptions, and there is some people that may be more susceptible to sunlight, and they may need to take further precautions. So for all the other categories, there is not a direct proof that they cause cancer in humans. That's why they're called possibly or probably carcinogenic. But in this classification, they're just taking into account the hazard, the potential to cause harm. They're not taking into account the actual amount that people are exposed to. So this is like the polar bear. This is the polar bear classification. It's based on hazard. It doesn't take into account risk.